Folks, you are listening to Race Matters, and I am the host, Eddie Carson. And like we do every week, we delve into the nomenclature of talking about issues such as race, class, gender, culture, and all the ways in which we can think about how these conversations pull us together as we engage in some of the thought processes that are necessary. But yet, it also kind of brings about this recognition that there are forces and there are factors that divide us too. And that's some of the things we want to do here on Race Matters. We're here at 96.3 Joppa Radio, Newburyport, Massachusetts. You can find Race Matters on SoundCloud, YouTube, and on my website, professorcarson.com. As always, I'm excited because I get to have conversations with just thought-provoking guests who are doing fantastic stuff, whether it's nationally, such as our guest today, Brea Baker, locally in communities, but things that are going to move the needle and the thread in terms of how we think about the elements of society, things that we need to confront. I'm just going to say a few things about my friend Brea Baker here, whom I'm just deeply honored to have here at Race Matters. Brea Baker's a freedom fighter, a writer in that order. I just want to point that out. Who's been working on the front lines for over a decade as a student activist, whom she attended the Yale University, earning her BA degree in political science, now as a movement journalist and a national organizer. Over the last several years, she's contributed to dozens of electoral and advocacy campaigns, including Next at Yale movement. She was really a force in thinking about the 2017 Women's March. And more than anything else, she is just a soul sister who really cares deeply about the humanity of folks and the things that are happening here, too. We're going to delve into reparations. We're going to delve into her book, Rooted, and really kind of get a little background information on this wonderful sister here who's just doing incredible stuff as a nationally well recognized activist and author. My friend, Brea, welcome to Race Matters.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad to be back in conversation with you. And I just know we're going to get into some really good conversation.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, one of the things that I didn't say is that I've had the honor of bringing Brea to my community to be a speaker, fantastic communicator, presenter, just that really that oral dialectical notion that you present is just so good. It make a brother like me just feel kind of cow down and everything too, but that's okay. That's what we're doing. So you know what? We're going to go ahead and we're just going to kind of delve into some substance here and everything too, as we think about having such a wonderful guest such as Brea here on the fold. You know, Brea, I'm curious. You know, share with us. You are a nationally recognized author, activist. Where did that come from for you?
Good question. I really was radicalized by my college experience.
Mhm.
I attended Yale University, and it came as a surprise to me, and it might be surprising to you all that I was so surprised, but I didn't expect to be surrounded by so much wealth and so much whiteness at Yale.
Mm.
I had grown up in a community that was predominantly Black and brown. I had, was in middle school when Barack Obama was elected president for the first time. I was really leaning into and feeding into this idea of a post-racial America. And then getting and arriving on Yale's campus was that like whiplash of, oh no, there is a hierarchy. There is a
Mhm.
status quo. It is being very much maintained and meticulously upheld by the alumni of this university. They're training you to be someone who upholds that hierarchy. And so I really remember having such a visceral reaction to what I was witnessing at the campus. When I was a Yale student, the endowment was over $20 billion, and just thinking of how much money this university had while not paying property taxes,
Mhm.
while over policing the nearby Black and brown communities, just all of these things. And on top of that, I'm going to college at a time when the Black Lives Matter movement is proliferating. I graduated high school the year that Trayvon Martin was murdered by George Zimmerman. It was the summer between my freshman and sophomore years that George Zimmerman was acquitted. It was my sophomore year that and junior years that we had Mike Brown and Eric Garner and Sandra Bland and so many other victims of police brutality. And we were also following the energy of Occupy Wall Street. So I was surrounded by movement building that was really asking us to think more critically about who is allowed to thrive in America and who is considered collateral damage for other people's thriving. And I realized that it was often people who looked like me, people who came from my communities, who were expected to be the worker force and the backs that were stepped on for others to succeed and to be successful. And I just wasn't okay with that. So I think that radicalization, I didn't know what I was going to do with it, but I just knew I can't I I can't unknow it. And so now that I know it, what is my role? What is my lane? And I kept finding myself in this place of storytelling and recognizing that the story we are telling about America, especially around patriotism, is that we have to love this country no matter what. And I subscribe to the James Baldwin school of thought that says, if I love you, I have the not just the right but the responsibility to critique you endlessly, to say
Mm.
you can and must be better. And so for me, it just became, if you want me to be patriotic, give me something to be excited about. If you want me to wave a flag and say I live in the richest country in the world, what does that mean for us? But to just throw out these labels and to throw out this toxic patriotism and toxic nationalism with nothing worth celebrating, I was never going to be okay with. And I wanted to tell a different story about America.
So you arrive at Yale, a lot of things are exploding, and we're seeing this transformation that's happening. And I don't want to really call it a transformation because we know about the deep-rooted structural elements here in this place we call the United States, and a
Yes.
lot of the things, right, that you delve into in your book, Rooted. And when I think about your experience at Yale, which, by the way, I was just on their campus a couple days ago, staying at the study at Yale for a little bit, right around the
That
corner.
is one of the more beautiful hotels nearby. You did a good one.
That place, I tell you what, my hotel room looked like my study. All the books and everything that was
Listen.
there. But I also remember a story when you think about Yale, where, and I hope I'm not misquoting. And if I am, I'm going to go ahead and raise my hand here, folks, and apologize. You can always email and correct me. Was Yale the school where a student fell asleep on a in a lobby? A black student fell asleep in a dorm lobby, and someone called the cops on them?
Yes, 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 yes. That was Yale. That was Yale. Yale, that happened after I graduated. While I was a student at Yale, though, there was an instance where an actual friend of mine, a Black student at Yale, was leaving the library late at night, as many of us do, was accosted by Yale security. We didn't know at the time that Yale security were armed. They held him at gunpoint, made him get on the ground on his belly. And it was such a scary moment. What they didn't realize is the student they had just held at gunpoint after leaving the library was the son of New York Times reporter Charles Blow. It was on the cover of the New York Times the next day, as far as I can recall it. And it really sparked a big conversation around campus security being militarized, campus security operating like a police force. And again, who is this university designed to protect? So yes, this but Yale has a long standing history of there being incidents like those of Black and brown students being asked to prove that they belong there um, through very violent means and having police forces weaponized against them.
You use the interesting word there, and one of the things we're seeing particularly take place within the landscape of politics here in the United States. Folks really moving away from, well, we just don't want to talk about DEI, but we want to bring in things like belonging and how we make folks feel like they belong and they feel safe. When you were at Yale, did you feel like you belong there, or were there structures there every day that reminded you that you're just a guest here?
Mhm.
This is not your school, or did you kind of evolve to really feel like, no, this is my campus and I own it?
I think it was a little bit of both. I mean, there were definitely structures there designed to make me feel like I didn't belong. I remember often during my freshman year, and this will be comical to anyone who knows me, being asked if I was there on some sort of athletic scholarship. I don't have an athletic bone in my body. Okay, like
Come
there,
on, my friend. I mean, you got to have a little something there.
not one,
Not
not
one.
one. I'm telling you, not one. And so it being like, oh, interesting. People don't think that I could have gotten here on my academic merits. And then that feeling really ironic because when you meet legacy students who are
Hmm.
there because their parents donated or their grandparents donated or their great grandparents were some of the dumbest people I've ever met in my life were legacy students at Yale or were on some sort of athletic scholarship at Yale. And then there was the controversy after I graduated of the children of wealthy and
Yes.
famous people being given fake scholarships to sports like crew and soccer in exchange for their, for their donations to the university, so that because they knew that their children would not be able to get in and it wouldn't make sense to admissions officers if they were getting in purely off of academic merit, that they didn't
Mm.
have the grades, that they didn't have the SAT scores, the ACT scores, the community service. So it's like, wait, I did all of it the without the bribes, without the favors, without any need for the extra boost up. I made it in here. And so actually, who are you to tell me I don't belong here? I belong here more than many of you. I really earned this spot. And to understand that even those who are brilliant at Yale, many of them were really groomed from such a young age, from kindergarten and elementary school. Their parents are talking to counselors about how to put their children in the best position, how
Mhm.
to make sure their kids get the best grades, how to make sure their kids are in the right extracurriculars. So if I can get in without all of that coaching, then that proves that I more than deserve to belong here. And so it was a bit of both, where like by the end of my time there, I really learned to take on a more boldness about it, and lean into it. But it was definitely a journey. It was definitely a journey.
I love that story too. And, in people of color, particularly black and brown folks, we can all tell those stories. I remember once, I didn't go to Yale, folks. I just want to point that out. Yale, they just missed a boat. Or maybe I should have applied to get on that boat, but I still don't know if I would have gotten on the boat. And, Lowell, let me tell you, I remember being at an airport and I had my university shirt on, and someone walked up to me and said, "Oh, I went there too." I was like, "All right, all right." And the next question they asked me, "What sport did you play?" Oh, I remember being in this literary
Huh.
seminar. We're studying Joseph Conrad. And I make this profound statement. And I remember walking out of class, and this lady comes up to me from the class and say, "That was just brilliant. I never even thought about Heart of Darkness that way," and went on and on and on. And I remember turning to that person and saying, "Well, I appreciate that," offering that feedback. And then this is the gut punch thing, which I could have handled it better. My ego got ahead of me. She said, "I didn't know you were that smart. I just thought you were here to play ball."
That is mind blowing.
But it's a
That is
reality.
mind blowing. But it is. It is a reality. It really, really is.
When you were at Yale, and help me out, the Calhoun School,
Mhm.
is that they changed the name to the Calhoun School, right?
They did. So, Calhoun College, it was one of the residential colleges, which is to say, it's like a dorm. It has a dining hall. It's where students sleep. There is a basement full of amenities for students to benefit from, and it's a big part of um, your like it's a sub community within the Yale community. And so it's a big part of your identity at Yale. I was a member of or a student within Saybrook College. And so you have Yale pride, but then you have your residential college pride.
Mhm.
That's where you eat and sleep and play and where you meet most of your classmates because you're in such close proximity. And so the idea of there being a residential college named after John C. Calhoun, one of the most
Oh,
strongest defenders of slavery,
yeah.
also someone who was deeply involved in colonialism and land theft of indigenous lands as well. And so yeah, so it was something that Yale Black and Brown and Indigenous Yale students had been protesting for decades before I got on campus. And as a result of the campus organizing that we did in 2015 and 2016, the college was renamed. It was renamed after Grace Hopper. And so it's now Hopper College. And in addition, at the same time, Yale was building out two new residential colleges. One of those new ones was named after Pauli Murray, who's also a Yale alum, brilliant reverend, writer, orator, um, queer, gender, non-conforming, brilliant human being. And so, yeah, we definitely learned a lot from.
So, thinking about your work, right? Having to be a student, be an activist, advocate for the transformation and some of the things that need to happen at Yale University, being a political scientist, studying political science, all of
Mhm.
those things that are there really set your trajectory to writing folks a wonderful, wonderful book. A wonderful book. And, I had the honor of reading your book. Oh, I want to say it was probably it was back in October of this past year. And one of the things your book, Rooted, really delves into is really thinking about issues of Black land ownership. And I
Yeah.
remember one of the striking things about your book that you pointed out is that I believe from 1910 to 1997, Black folks lost 90%
Yes.
of their
Yep.
land. And before I ask, folks, before I invite Brea just to kind of comment on her book a little bit for us too, I do want you to know that I have a paper that I'm delivering at the American Historical Association in January, which is part of a chapter in my book on land in American West, where I
Mhm.
cite your work.
Thank you. That means the world. And I'm so
Oh,
excited about that because we got to talk a little bit about that when we were together in person and what you were working on and dreaming up.
well, don't worry, you're going to get a copy from the
I
publisher
can't
because
wait.
I'm hoping you'll review it. I can
Oh,
put you on
you
the
know
back of
that.
my book.
That's a given. That's a given.
All right, then I'm excited about that and everything too. So tell us a little bit about Rooted and not to step into your space here to share that, but my understanding is Rooted is really it's deeply a memoir of kind of anthropological analysis, historical factors that deal with the structural elements when we really think about issues of race, wealth, land, and all those other things that are here.
Yeah, yeah, it really is. And I didn't initially plan to focus so much on my family, but it really felt important because I didn't want anyone to walk away thinking that this is a one-off case. I really wanted to express the breadth that most Black American families, if they have been in this country for more than two or three generations, has a direct experience with land theft, whether that be through eminent domain,
Mhm.
heirs property loss, outright white supremacist violence, the Great Migration, and the fact that when you leave the South, you can't pack up your land into a suitcase. A lot of these people are fleeing in the middle of the night. You can't sell the land or the property either. Sharecropping and just the predatory nature of the fall of Reconstruction. So there are so many tactics that have been used to bully Black people off of our land. And I really wanted to share that. But for me, it is such a personal story because I am a sixth generation Black landowner. I always grew up feeling so much pride in that fact that my family has land in North Carolina that has been in the family for decades and decades and decades, that people in my ancestors and elders in my family didn't even know that a Brea Baker would once be born, but that I get to benefit from this beautiful land that they toiled over, that they worked tirelessly to make happen. Um, and so I wanted to share that love that Black people love the land so much that just because we were once forced to work that land does not mean that we don't love it still. We hate the exploitation, we love the land. And within my family, the first person to buy land in my family was my great 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 grandfather, Lewis Baker, who bought that land. He was born enslaved, was born treated as three-fifths of a person, born treated as property, to then one day buy something that his children would benefit from and farm to control the means of their labor and to be able to rest when they needed it and not have someone lording over them. And that, I just think that what foresight, what a gift for him to be able to see that in his lifetime and pass that legacy of land ownership on. But unfortunately, as you mentioned, the stats are really harrowing. Most Black families do not have land in their family anymore. Most Black families experience that loss that you said. We owned more land in between 1910 and 1920 than we do now. So for
Mm.
all of the so-called progress that we have made, and it's not to downplay any of that
Mhm.
has been made, but I think we were so focused on political representation, and we now see this gaping racial wealth gap. And it's not because of salary gaps or pay gaps, though those are important to fill too, but it is because land that grows exponentially in value with time has been snatched from under us, siphoned out of our communities, and funneled into the hands of corporations and trusts and endowments and land grant colleges, and that we have not been able to benefit from that um, by and large. And so when you meet a Black landowner, they're like a unicorn. They have
Mm.
survived everything that has been designed to take them out, to leave them depraved and destitute and dependent on someone else for food and housing and clothing and work. And that is important to say too. Land is not just a investment tool and something to be traded. Land is a very literal and tangible sense of one's freedom. It is soil that you can put a seed onto and grow food to feed yourselves. And Fannie Lou Hamer used to often talk about that, of like, you know, I don't want anyone having the ability to starve me, because when she was doing her voter registration work, she was a sharecropper. She would get evicted and fired in one sweep because the same person who controlled where she slept was the same person who controlled what she did for work and whether she was paid. And she said that that moment actually freed her because it pushed her off of the plantation, and that Black land ownership was the key to staying off of the plantation.
So much to think about, and I'm just chewing on as I do when I hear you speak, when I read your words and everything, and I constantly really think about my own narrative sometimes too. I think about, in my family, we don't own a lot of property. I'm not sure how much property we actually own in general. Right? I think about going back even to, I think it was 2016, 2017, the Spotlight series through um, the Boston Globe, where they talked about in the greater Boston area, right? Boston and in the surrounding areas, that for white folks, the average wealth is about $255,000. And for black folks, I think it's $8. And when I've used that stat before, you can hear people like, doing that thing where they're, well, I don't know if that's really true. I'm like, no, you look it up, right? These are, like yourself, investigative journalists. They do this kind of work and everything too. And you need to figure that out. Get off, those little small little 40-word things that people read and kind of delve into some information too. And
Yeah.
yet, when you think about land, I used to oftentimes fantasize about this notion of wine. I'll give you an example. I'm a big wine person. And I was like, what would it be like to have a vineyard, wines, and even wines that I passed down to family members? You
Yes.
don't just jump up and just have land like that. It's one of the reasons why I like the Brown Estate in Napa. I think it's the only black owned winery out there. And those things are just
Mhm.
a misnomer.
Yeah.
So we think about your work. Why should folks read your book? I mean, just hearing what you said is enough for me, but why should folks run out and grab that incredible book, Rooted?
I think there's a few reasons. Number one, when we talk about racial justice nationally, so much of our understanding center around a northern Black experience that exists in cities. And I understand why that happens, because there's a large concentration of Black people in cities like New York, Detroit, Chicago, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Oakland, Los Angeles, etc. Um, but even with that large concentration, there is no part of the country where more Black people live than the South.
Yes.
More than 55% of Black people live in the South, and that is after the Great Migration. Before the Great Migration, that number was like 80 to 90% of Black Americans, which means that even if we are not living in the South now, a lot of the racial trauma we are still dealing with, a lot of the vestiges of racial harm that we are still navigating were first transpired in the South. And so it is important that we not forget that the South is this like inception point in Black American history. It is a place where a lot of pain and devastation was endured. It is also a place where a lot of resilience and love was endured. It's no wonder that the South is where most of our musical genres were birthed. It's no wonder that the South is where most of our HBCUs exist. It is no wonder that the South is where a lot of our wealth first existed and was snatched from us. And
Mhm.
so I think it's really important that we not forget about this, the Black South, that we not forget that yes, we need to fight against what racism and anti-Blackness looks like in urban concrete jungles. We also need to understand what it looks like in rural and suburban communities. We also need to know why there's a Cancer Alley in Louisiana, and that all of those parishes were former plantations, and that most of the Black people who live there are descended from people who were enslaved on those very plantations. And we need to understand that even the harm that exists in northern cities, like poisoned water in Flint, Michigan, and Newark, New Jersey, those are great migration destination cities. It's all tied to the South. And I think that's really important to say. And so that we can expand our understanding of what racial justice even looks like. That if we figured out how to solve police brutality tomorrow, there would still be a racial wealth gap. There would still be anti-Blackness. There would still be food apartheid. There would still be a lot of injustice that Black people are enduring. And we owe it to ourselves to have a more robust and holistic conversation. I say this all the time. I just feel like again, it goes back to storytelling. The story we tell ourselves about racism totally underestimates white supremacy, totally underestimates it, because we believe that if we donate to these three organizations, that if we vote in this Black president or this Black senator, or we see this Black Supreme Court justice take the seat, if we see this Black billionaire getting a Grammy, that is enough. And the reality is that there are millions of Black Americans who are depending on us to have a better power analysis and a better lens of understanding race and white supremacy in this country, how meticulously it has been scaffolded over time, and for us to undo that just as meticulously. And I think we have to look at land theft as a really big part of that, because it's one of the nation's first sins. Taking land from Indigenous people, forcing Black people to work it, freeing Black people and not allowing us to own the means of our labor, and now creating a world where if you aren't born with a leg up, and those leg ups being truly built through trust funds and property holdings and land holdings, that it is so hard to get ahead. And we need to look at the source of the problem to be able to develop any sort of solution. The last thing I will say, and a big thing that I like to discuss in the book, is that when we look at land theft, it forces us to look at Indigenous people.
Mhm.
There's so much invisibilization of anti-indigeneity and of the harms that have been perpetrated against Indigenous communities and Native peoples in this country. And when you look at land theft, it forces you to look at Indigenous people, but also at our solidarity. The way that maroon communities are examples of Black and Indigenous people fighting back together. The way that um, across history, there have been so many moments where we have stood side by side and insisted on justice for both of our groups. And I think we need that energy now more than ever as well. If we're going, especially coming up on the 250th anniversary of America, we have to look at the two groups that experienced the most harm first because of the introduction of Europeans to this land, and look at that as a charting forward of there is no racial justice without justice for Indigenous Americans, without justice for Black Americans.
Folks, if you're chiming in, you're listening to Race Matters. I'm the host, Eddie Carson. This is Joppa Radio 96.3, and I am here with the author of the book Rooted, Brea Baker. And Brea, you mentioned those things, and earlier in our conversation, we talked about the issues of colleges that engage in practices of legacies, which the Supreme Court has said there's nothing wrong with legacy, but yet we've seen a work in how they've, taken away elements of affirmative action when we think about these narratives. And part of these larger narratives really bring us to, this point that, I want to bring up with you. And I do think there's definitely a connection with your work that's here too. Well, one of the words that people don't want to hear is reparations. And I recently ran into someone who described himself as a history buff. And, he started delving into all the reasons why we should have reparations. And folks, if you don't know, reparations in the US it's a simple proposal, because that's all it is a proposal to really compensate Black folks, specifically descendants of enslaved folks dating back
Yes.
through the centuries of slavery and racial terror, Southern apartheid, known as Jim Crow segregation, and then again, the ongoing systemic discrimination that exists. We
Yep.
know reparations, right, aims to address those racial wealth gaps and the things that you've talked about. I know you, particularly from our conversation, have a particular lens of thinking about reparation. And I'd love
Yes.
to invite you to the fold and share your thoughts as how we think about reparations, since so many folks are misinformed about it. What is it? What does it mean to you?
For me, there's a few things. One, I'll start off with just like the ideological reasoning behind reparations. What I love is one, the understanding that reparations is an international framework. Black Americans did not just out of nowhere think of this theory. There is an international understanding of who qualifies for reparations and what it should seek to do. And in other countries, the language they use is truth and reconciliation. I love that. I think it is so clear because it helps us to understand that reparations needs to be this country telling the truth and the whole truth about what it did to us and our ancestors, about the ongoing legacy of that harm because it was not addressed when it needed to be, and how that harm is compounded over time. And then reconciliation, restitution, which
Mhm.
is to say, we're going to make people whole who have had something taken from them. We are going to put in measures to make sure it doesn't happen to future generations. And we're going to have a reckoning and a conversation about how to make sure this doesn't ever happen again. And I think that is what reparations needs to look like. So that's ideological. I think it's important. And then again, the justification that um, this has been done before. It's not that reparations is impossible. With each passing day, second, hour that we do not implement reparations, the cost of reparations gets higher because we have new victims, because those older victims are it's accruing interest, right? And so
Mm.
we have to attack this issue head on. What does it look like to have reparations? To me, for the truth standpoint, reparations means um actually having real public education on the legacy of white supremacy, anti-blackness, um, and the ongoing vestige of chattel slavery and all that came from that. That public education would mean we wouldn't have book bans because you can't have book bans in a world with reparations, right? We would have robust curriculums where it's not an elective that you opt into to learn about Black history, that everyone is responsible for learning that. That if you already graduated high school and you're not going to learn it in a classroom, that we're creating town hall opportunities and museums and monuments and other spaces of public learning and unlearning, because it is important for every American to understand what we're doing, not just off of the altruistic nature of we should all know the history, but also so that if one administration says we're going to install reparations, another administration doesn't undo it. That we
Right.
all understand it and we can cement this in place, and it doesn't get, this political pawn that is pushed back and forth of whether we're doing right by Black Americans. Um, as far as the actual restitution and reconciliation pieces, reparations to me personally would not look like a one-off check. I do lean into some of the language around a check because it is some of the language that, for example, Dr. Martin Luther King said, when we come to Washington, we are coming to get that check.
Yep.
But oftentimes, I feel like the language of a check is more a metaphor for the fact that there is a debt that is owed and that someone has to pay it. But I think that it is important for that debt to be paid back in a way that is life changing for Black Americans. If every black person tomorrow got $10,000, that could be eaten up so quickly by bills and existing debt, whether that be student loan debt, medical debt, whatever the case may be. That would not be life changing for us. I want to see reparations in the form of baby bonds so that black children will turn 18 in a world where they have a trust, where they have assets. I want it to look in the form of land redistribution, eminent domain reversals, where black people are getting land returned to them, are getting vacant properties deeded over to them. I want it to look like tax exemptions. I want it to look like grants that don't need to be paid back for black people to invest in themselves and their families and their communities. I want it to look like a windfall of money for HBCUs and black institutions. I want it to look like I want it to look like things that my great grandchildren would still be saying, wow, great grandma Brea got this in 2025. And as a result, we are able to dream in a different way. We are able to imagine higher education in a different way. And honestly, what I hope comes from reparations, because I think this is something that comes up, well, how are we going to pay for all that? I hope that as a result of reparations being implemented, people are starting to realize there's a lot of money out there. As we are implementing reparations, we can also have universal health care and guaranteed income and student and medical debt cancellation and a bunch of other things. Because again, living in the richest country in the world should mean something. And it was our ancestors who built that wealth. And it was the fact that our ancestors weren't paid that the United States was able to have such a huge profit margin. And
Mm.
so I think it's so important that we are able to be the first benefactors of the wealth that we created against our will, but then that we recognize that there is so much to go around. There isn't a, we need a more abundant mindset that says every American can be cared for. That at the same time that we are getting reparations, that indigenous communities are getting land back, that that military bases are being turned over, that public parks and forests are being turned over to indigenous tribes, that treaties are being reexamined and honored, that every university that does a land acknowledgement actually gives some of it back, right? Like I would love to see all of that happen, but I'm not going to forego the promise and the owed debt to our ancestors in saying that. I'm very clear that I want to start with Black Americans.
You know, you talk about this idea about we think about reparations and anytime people hear the word universal and this and that, and folks delve into what you noted about the political and the ideological resistance, facts that people think reparations, they challenge dominant narratives about, American exceptionalism, right? Just kind of pull yourself up by the bootstrap, just work a little harder. This notion of individualism and meritocracy provoking strong opposition from those who fear it, who undermine these ideas that are there. And it's just thought provoking in terms of the narrative that you just outlined about thinking about it. And yet, my friend, I hear you say that as logical, as thoughtful as you just did. And yet, what we're seeing here in what year is it? 2025. I get confused sometimes. I don't know if it's 1965, 2025, where there's just this pushback against any semblance of progress to make us feel like we belong as American citizens. The United States has never issued an apology for slavery.
Never.
Never. It never will because of the legal ramifications. I think Barack Obama made a couple little small attempts, but that involves a lot of acts of Congress and folks like that. And people are like, I don't want anything to do with it because guess what? I never had a slave. I
Right.
never did anything. Right there.
And what I say all the time is, but you are getting to relax in the leisure that past made possible. That you are getting to benefit from a society that gives you certain chances and opportunities and access that it will never give me price precisely because of that sordid past.
Mm,
So that's number one. Whether you or your ancestors never owned a slave, if you are white in this country, you could be a recent immigrant. If you are white in this country, you are benefiting from a racial hierarchy that only existed because people who looked like us were once treated as property. Were treated like this water bottle, were treated like a mule, a cow, a table, were inanimate objects in the eyes of the law and had everything extracted from them, like a towel wrung dry, in order to make that access and opportunity possible. But also, there are a lot of white Americans who are avoiding the work, and this is something that I talked about in Rooted too, is that writing this book required so much family research, looking at deed records and all sorts of things to retrace our steps. There's so many white Americans who are avoiding the work of retracing their family steps precisely because of what they don't want to uncover, of
Mm,
what they don't want to know about. Oh, shoot, maybe my family never owned slaves in the South, but they owned a textile mill in the North that depended on the really cheap cotton that they got from the South. They were very happy to do business with enslavers and human traffickers when the price was right. Maybe my family did own slaves or were overseers or were in some ways ensnared and actually not ensnared, willing participants of a slave economy, and kept it alive in whatever ways that that looks like. And so that is also something, is like you can't say I don't want to be held accountable and you haven't done any work to ensure that your family lines hands are clean. And I think in the same way that Black Americans talk about wanting to be our ancestors' wildest dream, we need a lot of white Americans to do the work so that they can understand how they can be their ancestors' worst nightmare, how they can be a traitor to the systems that their ancestors installed and kept going and made possible. Um, and 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 then to say, I've done everything that I can. But
mm,
until then, there are a lot of people walking around with blood on their hands, with blood on their trust funds, with blood on their land holdings. You know, going to Yale and seeing so many peers had ranches in all parts of the Midwest, and all of this land is desecrated, stolen land. You don't get that land without it being taken from someone else first. So I just think that there's so many people who want to conveniently absolve themselves of the responsibility of the past, but love to bear the fruit and benefit from the past.
folks, you're listening to Race Matters. I'm Eddie Carson, and I'm here with author Brea Baker here at 96.3 Joppa Radio. And as we think about this, and we think about the things that need to happen, and one of the things you are very good at is storytelling and really trying to encourage and create thoughtful conversations. This is a topic that I think it needs a lot of storytelling because white folks are going to be resistant to coming to the table to even think about any of these things: racism, structural racism, reparations, that fear. What
Mhm.
have your conversations with white folks been like using that gift of communication, storytelling, bringing them into the fold to understand? What are some of the positive aspects you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think there are a lot of people who do want to see something different, who feel like, wow, I have been able to learn um, so much about this history and my place in it and what I can do differently. Because when you look at land theft, you're digging into racial justice, economic justice, environmental justice. These are some of the biggest movements and issues of our time. Is man-made climate change and economic inequality and racial injustice. And by examining the relationship between Black people and land in this country, you get to sit at the intersection of all three of those. And I think there is a lot of interest and passion in doing something different about it. I was in Denver, and an older white woman who was retired from her job said that she came to one of my book talks with her daughter and said that she was so fired up about it, that they were going to do a lot of family history. They were going to look into whether there is any organizing being done to establish a reparations task force in the state of Colorado and how they can get involved and support it. And she's so excited to have the free time to spend on it. And her daughter pulled me to the side afterwards and was like, she's never seen her mother so excited about a project in in a really long time, but
Mhm.
really never seen her mother so excited about doing something that would require her giving up power. And that she was so grateful that I could share it in a way that is an invitation for white people to take up a spot, to say there is a job for you to do that is uniquely positioned for you to do. And it can't just be Black people saying we need reparations. We need white people in the fold doing that very work as well. I was in Kansas, it was a young white queer couple who talked about having inherited family land and wanting to do more research on how that land came into the family, how they might be able to leverage it towards more ethical relationships between Black and Indigenous folks in Kansas. And so I think that um, while this book is definitely an indictment, it's also an invitation for sure to say that we don't need to just hang our heads and say, woe is us. Like there's a lot that we can do. It is very easy to deed over land. It is very easy to create cultural easements and to say someone else deserves access to this land just as much, if not more than me. And what if we all did that? What if we all leaned into communalism and against individualism and made the road by walking? And I think that's what we're going to see. I think by the time the federal government invests in reparations, it will be because there were so many localized instances of it and examples of it being successful that they will have been behind the curve. And that's typically what happens with the government. They passed the Civil Rights Act after the South is already being desegregated.
Mhm.
They invest in um, uh, shifts in policing after local municipalities have already invested in that themselves. And so I think we need to prove that there is an interest and a demand for this, and the federal government will follow.
Oh, that is great stuff, my friend. And I think back to the community of Newburyport in Massachusetts, where, there've been small ongoing conversations about reparations and thinking about the challenges of gentrifications and within that community, like home ownership and being able to live or realities that are there. And it
Yeah,
becomes this kind of interracial thing that community oftentimes wrestle with and they think about. So,
yeah.
as we come to the end of this episode of Race Matters, I want to thank author, noted, brilliant intellectual scholar, just awesome humanist, Brea Baker, for coming onto this show and just kind of enlightening me and enlightening you as the listener. So many things that are here. Brea, as I like to do all the time with my guests, is I like for my guests to have the last word. My friend, you have the last word.
Well, first of all, I'm just so grateful for being on the show with you. Thank you for bringing me on to Race Matters. It means the world. To listeners, I encourage you to get your own copy of Rooted. Even if that's not spending your own dollar, go to your local library, ask if they have a copy. If they don't, a great way to support is to encourage them to get a copy. If you are going to buy a copy, I encourage you to do so from a Black-owned bookstore. You can easily do that online through bookshop.org. Find a Black-owned bookstore and buy your copy directly from there. That'll be shipped to you, or visit one in person. But I think it is an important use of our activism to not just read about racial justice work, but to also have our actions align with it. And lastly, Juneteenth just passed, July 4th is coming up. What better time to be interrogating how this country came to exist, on whose backs it came to exist, and what we're going to do differently. As I said earlier, we are approaching the 250th anniversary of this nation, and we need to make the next 250 years look a lot better than the last 250. So, in addition to reading the book, please find a local organization that you can support. There are only 3 states in the country that have reparations task forces. Those are California, New York, and Illinois. If you are in one of those 3 states, I encourage you to look up what that task force is doing. Are they just studying, studying, studying? Are they implementing anything? If you live in a state that doesn't even have a task force at all, I encourage you to get connected to organizers who are doing something about it. And if you want to get connected to a group, I strongly encourage you to get connected to Bliss Collective. That's Black Liberation Indigenous Sovereignty, Bliss. And they're doing some really great work, especially in New York, that anyone can get involved in, but are building a nationwide movement around our shared solidarity. So that's blisscollective.org. Thank you so much again, Eddie, and to all the listeners.
Folks, the wonderful, the amazing, the brilliant Brea Baker. This is Race Matters. Until next time, thank you for listening.